Coronavirus 2019 influences every aspect of our lives and accelerates societal transformations. The global scale of the pandemic enables scientists and us to compare contexts and cultures, while unprecedented media coverage of this psychosocial event allows for a review for various societal perspectives. The impact of COVID-19 pandemic differs between socioeconomic strata, age cohort, gender, culture, and personality. People and societies experienced different intensities of threat and control and emotions such as anxiety and frustration and behaved differently. Policies and citizen adherence influenced infection risk, mortality, and resilience during social isolation and prolonged social mitigation measures. Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar once said, and IGNTU understands that the aim of education is the knowledge not of facts but of values. It is in such times like this we get opportunities to test our knowledge and nurture our understanding. This webinar is an attempt to describe and understand the emotional, somatic, and mental health responses over the spring of 2020, as well as changes in the social world and in our feelings, thoughts, wants, behaviors, and values in the light of literature and life during COVID-19. Ladies and gentlemen, may I now request Professor Krishna Singh, the head of Department of English and Foreign Languages and the convener of this webinar, to present a welcome address and enlighten us with the concept note of this program. May I request Professor Krishna Singh.
Very good morning to all. In the inaugural session of the 2 days international webinar on literature and life in the era of COVID-19, organized by the Department of English and Foreign Languages, Indira Gandhi National Travel University, Amarakntak, I feel honored to welcome the chairman of the session, Professor Sri Prakash Mani Tripathi, Honorable Vice Chancellor of Indira Gandhi National Travel University, who is a great visionary, seasoned administrator, political scientist, and an expert on international politics and Indian government politics. He will join the meet very soon. I also welcome the chief guest, Professor Rajkumar, Honorable Vice Chancellor of Punjab University, Chandigarh, who is a distinguished academician, researcher, and educational administrator. Under his dynamic leadership, Punjab University has been adjudged as the best university in the country by US News and World Report ranking 2019. I also welcome the guest of honor, Professor Stephen Gill, who is a multiple award-winning Indo-Canadian self-exiled poet, fiction writer, and essayist. He has authored more than 30 books. He is the subject of doctoral dissertation, and 13 books of critical studies have been released. He is not well, but he has sent his video message to us. I also welcome the special guest, Professor Madhumita Das, Honorable Vice Chancellor of Fakir Mohan University, Balasore, who specializes in igneous petrology, industrial minerals, and environmental geology. She is an acclaimed academician, researcher, and administrator. I extend my warm welcome to keynote speaker, Professor David Ayers, who is Professor of Modernism and Critical Theory at the University of Kent, UK. He has authored and edited books on modernist literature and the avant-garde. His executive role in European Network of Avant-Garde and Modernist Studies Association, and British Association of Modernist Studies has been acknowledged widely. I also welcome Professor Khem Singh Dehria, Dean, Faculty of Humanities and Philology, who always cooperates in all academic endeavors. I also extend my warm welcome to the eminent scholars who are delivering plenary talks. Professor A.B. Sharma from IGNTU, Professor Bhagwat Nayak from Rajiv Gandhi Central University, Professor Amita Singh from BHU, Professor Ajay Kumar Shukla from DDU University, Gorakhpur, Professor Rasmi Atri from AMU, Professor Satyarth Prakash Tripathi from MET University, Professor Sarwan Kumar Sharma, Gurukul Kangli University, Professor Sumitra Kurketi from MJP Rohilkhand University, Professor Suchita Pathania from Jammu University, and Professor Tirtheswar Singh from IGNTU. Senior faculty who are chairing the technical session also deserve special welcome. Professor Suren Kumar Chauhan from Dayal Bagh, Educational Institute, Professor Samia Khan from AMU, Professor R.K. Shina from Bhagalpur University. Guest of the valedictory session, they also deserve a special welcome. And we have Professor B.J. Singh, Vice Chancellor of Pandit Sundarlal Sharma Open University, Bilaspur, Professor N.D.R. Chandra, former Vice Chancellor, Bastari University, Professor Amiya Bhushan Sharma, Indira Gandhi National Open University, Delhi, Professor S.K. Singh, Nilambar Pitambar University, Jharkhand, who are the guests of the valedictory session. I also welcome the teaching fraternity and delegates who are connected with the program and going to present paper in different technical sessions. Indira Gandhi National Travel University, Amarakntak, which was established by an Act of Parliament of India in 2007, started functioning in July 2008. It is known for two characteristic features, that is national and tribal, which exhibit the pan-Indian jurisdiction of the university and focus on travel-centric issues catering tribals' long-cherished dream of higher education at their threshold. The university started with a meager number of 154 students in 2008, which has now multiplied to more than 3,700 across 30 departments, which offer UG, PG, PhD, and PG diploma programs. Department of English and Foreign Languages, which was established in 2008, offers BA, MA, PhD, and PG diploma in English proficiency and soft skills. There are 6 faculty members from universities of higher repute with specialization in multiple branches of British, American, African, Indian, and literatures of third world countries, linguistics and English language teaching, ELT. The department, since its inception, has organized one national seminar, one international seminar, one national webinar, and as a sequel, the current international webinar, hosting scholars of national as well as international recognition. The department is credited to have one international journal of travel, literature, and culture studies that is edited by Professor Krishna Singh, that's me. The onslaught of COVID-19 pandemic adversely affected the entire human life, disrupting the normal goings on. Complete lockdown opened new vistas and horizons of imagination, which is a positive sign that introduced new genre of literary writings and evolution of new formats and stylistic features. Alternative modes of articulation and literary expression assert a new era of e-text and hypertext and multiple formats. The spirit of age, especially COVID-19 effect, is manifest in contemporary writings, that is short poems, narratives, short stories, condensed fiction writings, literary reactions, conversations, interviews of the literary giants, video clips, sharing on social sites and the media, socio-cultural behavior, dislocation and trauma of migration and homelessness, birth of nationalistic feeling, religious awakening, alternative modes of teaching, emerging new lifestyle, dietary habits, and health awareness, and India's initiative to tackle COVID-19 and its global acknowledgement are the core concern which present webinar aims to highlight through logical discourse, plenary lectures, research papers, and the talks by eminent scholars. Creative writing session intends to provide space to new writings exhibiting the effect of COVID-19. In the webinar, there are certain sub-themes: literary creations under COVID-19, literature in the face of COVID-19, thematic contents and stylistic features, poetry in the times of COVID-19, literature vis-a-vis life, changing linguistic patterns in the works of art, emerging new genre, short stories, short literary reactions, videos, conversations, interviews, critiques on YouTube, websites, Twitter, etc. Alternative modes of literature and language teaching during COVID-19, contemporary Hindi and regional literatures under COVID-19, changing socio-cultural behavior under COVID-19, and the dislocation and trauma of migration and homelessness, nationalism and
valuable additions in the very cause of this webinar. I thank you once again, and indeed we feel honored to have everyone here connected to us. As a gesture of respect, love, and gratitude, I request Professor Khem Singh Dharia, Dean, Faculty of Humanities and Philology, to address the gathering on Google Meet with his motivating words. May I request Dean Sir to please come forward and address the gathering.
Thank you, Tasib ji. Good morning, all of you. In today's National international webinar organized by the Department of English and Foreign Language, Indira Gandhi National Tribal University, Amarakntak. I welcome the esteemed chairman, Professor Sri Prakash Mani Tripathi, Honorable Vice Chancellor of Indira Gandhi National Tribal University, Amarakntak. Chief guest, Professor Raj Kumar, Honorable Vice Chancellor of Punjab University, Chandigarh. Guest of honor, Professor Stephen Gill. Special guest, Professor Madhumita Das, Honorable Vice Chancellor, Fakir Mohan University, Valsad. Keynote speaker, Professor David Ayers, and all concerned with the program. अंग्रेजी एवं विदेशी भाषा विभाग, मानविकी एवं भाषा संकाय में कोविड-19 के काल में जीवन और साहित्य विषय पर अंतर्राष्ट्रीय वेब संगोष्ठी का आयोजन हो रहा है। आज साहित्य समय से संवाद कर रहा है। कोरोना काल में जो साहित्यकार आज रचना कर रहे हैं वह भविष्य के दृष्टा बनेंगे। वर्तमान में जो लिखा जा रहा है भविष्य में उसका मूल्यांकन होगा। आज हम देख रहे हैं कि इस कोरोना काल में तकनीकी हमारे कितने काम आ रही है। इसी तकनीकी ने आज विश्व को जोड़ा है, उसी का लाभ हम ले पा रहे हैं। चाहे वेब संगोष्ठी हो या कोई मीटिंग हो या किसी भी प्रकार का संबंध, लॉकडाउन में तकनीकी काम कर रही है। जीवन में साहित्य का और साहित्य में जीवन का अटूट संबंध है। साहित्य ही सामाजिक जीवन का दर्पण है। सच्चा साहित्य समाज का दिशा दर्शन कर रहा है। इस वेब संगोष्ठी के संयोजक, अंग्रेजी एवं विदेशी भाषा विभाग के अध्यक्ष प्रोफेसर कृष्णा सिंह एवं उनकी टीम को मैं बहुत बहुत बधाई एवं शुभकामनाएं देता हूं। सभी वक्ताओं का भी मैं हार्दिक अभिनंदन करता हूं। आई विश एवरी सक्सेस फॉर दी वेबिनार। थैंक यू।
Thank you very much, sir. This is indeed very motivating and inspiring for all of us to listen to your speech. And now we are thrilled. Moving on, may I now request the keynote speaker, Professor David Ayers, to be connected to us in just a while. David Ayers is the Professor of Modernism and Critical Theory at the University of Kent, UK. He is the author and editor of several books on modernist literature and the avant-garde, including monographs on Wyndham Lewis, the 1920s, and the impact of Russian Revolution on modernist writing. He has held executive roles with the European Network of Avant-garde and Modernist Studies, the Modernist Studies Association, and the British Association Modernist Studies. He is currently working on Utopia. Ladies and gentlemen, may I have the honor to invite our keynote speaker, Professor David Ayers, the dynamic orator, to be the guiding light and address the gathering. Thank you.
Good morning. I hope you can all hear me. Good morning to you all. Thank you very much to Dr. Tausifur Rahman for that very kind introduction. I am very pleased to be joining you today. I would like to express my thanks to the Honourable Vice Chancellor, Professor Tripathi, and to the Dean of Humanities and Philology, Professor Daria, who has just spoken. And I would like to express my particular thanks and regards to Professor Krishna Singh, Head of the Department of English and Foreign Languages, and the convener of this webinar, who has invited me to participate. And I would also like to express my pleasure in joining the distinguished guests, particularly Professor Madhumita Das, Professor Stephen Gill, who I'm sorry to hear is ill, but who I've met before, and Professor Raj Kumar. As Professor Singh has just pointed out, the scope of this inquiry is, in this webinar is a large one, and I hope the small corner that I'm coming from here might be able to contribute something. In facing the challenge of giving this talk, one of my first reflections concerned the difficulty that all of us have, even mapping our own individual life, let alone in reflecting coherently on the life of our times. As a scholar of the literature of the early 20th century, I am more accustomed to reflecting on the life of people who have left us and whose individual and collective life presents a relatively stable image. Even then, to say relatively stable might still mean almost not stable at all. On the one hand, those of us who are involved in literary studies may seem to be engaging with a stable set of literary monuments. But what we also know from recent times is that monuments, which once seemed like something to be celebrated, may come to appear as the outdated artifacts of oppression and may serve to conceal the very history which they claim to embody and represent. Nothing stays still, and certainly nothing stays as still as a statue. Speaking of the fall of monuments, one historian responded to the accusation that people who were engaged in this of pulling down statues were in some way rewriting history. Her response was to say that in a way, all that historians ever do is to rewrite history. She was right, and that is also true of literary history. One of the things of which I am most mindful in my own work is the manner in which literary scholars, and perhaps the scholars of culture more generally, tend to see the period which produced literary or cultural work through the lens of the books, paintings, photographs, and so on of the period that they are studying. Much as we like to see history through statues and through the biographies of great men, as Virginia Woolf was at pains to point out in her novels. And I'm thinking here of Virginia Woolf's novel, Mrs. Dalloway, which features a military parade down Whitehall in a novel which contrasts the flux of everyday life to the stony life presented by the Whitehall statues and by the stone-clad British Museum. So all I am noting here as a starting point is that it can be difficult to see writing as something more than, less than, and different to the period which has produced it and on which it reflects. Literary theory has always taught us to be mindful of this question. Yet despite this, I often note how hard it is to get this straight in our heads, even though, to the modern critic, this seems to be almost a reflexive assumption. Perhaps strangely, one of the hardest things to map in literary and cultural terms is the impact of major national and global events on cultural production and practices. It may seem counterintuitive to say so. After all, if we once again take the example of English literature, there can be few scholars in this field who are not aware that the First World War produced a great deal of poetic writing. We are quite aware of the famous anti-war poets who wrote during the war, and historians of the period are also aware of the very large quantity of often amateur pro-war poetry writing that also took place in that period. We call this war poetry, and there are numerous anthologies and commentaries on it. This much is a truism. But then literary historians have also noted that the fashion for war poetry disappeared as soon as the war had ended. And this leaves us with a more difficult literary historiographical problem. We can all now agree, and once again we are looking at the context of English literature, that the First World War produced great losses and was responsible for trauma throughout society. How far then do we argue that the war influenced the content of literature in the immediate aftermath of the war? How far do we argue that it influenced the form of that literature? And how far do we argue that its presence is indirect, requiring certain techniques, literary methodological techniques for its detection? Since war poetry as a genre was quickly abandoned, how do we look for the reflection of the war in the piece which followed, the insecure and complex piece which we know and which they did not, was to culminate in another war. So I'm reflecting on our theme here today from a literary historiographical perspective. And one thing I am noting is the difficulty in mapping general cultural phenomena through certain artifacts and processes, even from a historical perspective. I would add that what complicates that question for historians is the additional dimension that each period also tries to give a theoretical account of itself. It can be difficult, then, either to give a proper account of the literary or artistic works of a period, or to give an account of the commentary by those who produced those works or who reflected on them. One example of this, which I would like to mention, is the tendency to see T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land as a reflection of its time. Now, I am not going to say that that poem does not reflect its time in any way, but that the manner or the mode in which it reflects it is complicated. And I would like to introduce here a quotation from the once authoritative English critic F.R. Leavis. This is something that Leavis says about The Waste Land. Please bear with me, it's a quite long quotation. Leavis asks, what is the significance of the modern wasteland? The answer may be read in what appears as the rich disorganization of the poem. The seeming disjointedness is intimately related to the erudition that has annoyed so many readers and to the wealth of literary borrowings and allusions. And he goes on, these characteristics reflect the present state of civilization. The traditions and cultures have mingled, and the historical imagination makes the past contemporary. No one tradition can digest so great a variety of materials, and the result is a breakdown of forms and the irrevocable loss of that sense of absoluteness which seems necessary to a robust culture. And he concludes, in considering our present plight, we have also to take account of the incessant, rapid change that characterizes the machine age. The result is a breach of continuity and uprooting of life. This last metaphor, he says, has a peculiar aptness, for what we are witnessing today is the final uprooting of the immemorial way of life rooted in the soil. So that's the end of my very long quotation from Leavis. Leavis wrote this in his book, New Bearings in English Poetry, which was published in 1932, 10 years after the publication of The Waste Land. In terms of that 10-year gap, we could read it in one of two ways. In one way, Leavis's comment belongs to the period of the poem. In another way, it is already a historical reflection on it. To me, as a reader of this poem, it seems clear that the immediate reception of The Waste Land saw the poem much more as a reflection on the general cultural condition than as a personal expression. To my own mind, as a reader at this point, I feel relatively clear that the surface complexity of the poem conceals a very personal state of despair on the part of the poet. When Eliot, in later years, dismissed his own work in this poem as, quote, a few rhythmical grumblings, I think that this is what he was getting at. Not everyone, I realise, will necessarily have arrived at the same point of view on this poem as I have. But I can report that one of the things I tell my students of modernist literature is not to constantly repeat the claim that The Waste Land simply reflects the breakdown of society and the breakdown of language in the wake of the First World War. And one reason that I show them this quotation from Leavis in my lecture to them is to evidence the fact that commentators who are much closer to these events than we are today did indeed read the poem in this way. I show them that they did read the poem in this way, and that we fully know that they did, but that there is room to say something else about it, and that the challenge for us is to break apart the apparent circularity of poem and commentary. One of the things that the quotation from Leavis evidences is a very pessimistic reading of the historical events in the years following the First World War. We already need to say something nuanced about this. The Waste Land was produced in 1922, a year very different than the period in which Leavis made his own comments. But one of the things that I think we need to emphasize is that even as the future of democracy began to seem bleak in the early 1930s, not everyone in this period saw contemporary changes in such a pessimistic way. Not everyone followed Leavis in seeing industrial modernization as an uprooting of the agricultural way of life, which supposedly went back to a time said to be immemorial. Not everyone shared a nostalgia for an imagined Middle Ages. Indeed, the weakening of the British Empire in the wake of the First World War gave hope to many. Of course, it gave hope in the colonies, and it was not distant India, but proximate Ireland, which was the first to liberate itself from the yoke of empire. And for my and perhaps your amusement, I'd like to report that my spell check rewrote the yoke of empire as yoga vampire. Anyway, I did manage to correct that. So it was also a period in which many in Britain became hopeful about the future of socialism and of feminism. So labour organisation had become more powerful, women had been granted the vote for the first time, and the Labour Party achieved its first short spell as a minority government in Britain. Whether as an individual you were pessimistic or optimistic in this period rather depended what side you were on, or at least what side you believed yourself to be on, or who you rightly or wrongly assumed to be on your side. So, for example, those who, like Leavis, favoured the metaphor of literary disjointedness in the poem as a reflection of the breakdown of society might simply be at odds with those who thought that finally social justice was beginning to win, and that far from breaking apart, everything was now, thankfully, coming together. So we are looking here at the complexities of literary historiography in particular, and of cultural historiography more generally. In a moment, I am going to get on to the question of the cultural historiography of disease. But first, I would like to briefly mention my own scholarly engagement with the question of culture and the period to which it belongs and which it appears to reflect and embody. In my own most recent full-length study, I looked at the question of the cultural impact of the Russian Revolution on British modernism. In this study, I was looking at Anglophone literature and not at other national contexts, which were certainly more or less different. I was also not looking at the period of the 1930s, where it is well known that literary and cultural figures were quite consciously engaged with questions of communism and fascism. Instead, I had been very struck by the contrast between British Romanticism and British modernism. The British Romantic writers had reflected quite explicitly on the French Revolution and its virtues, even if in some cases they were to turn against it. By contrast, the modernist writers, admittedly with one or two exceptions, leaned away from the Russian Revolution and either expressed disdain for or indifference to socialism, or even, in an open or concealed fashion, supported fascism. In investigating this, I discovered that there was indeed a great deal of discussion in the general culture about the Russian Revolution, about its nature, about its implications for the world, and of course about its implications for Britain. There was a great deal of publication in newspapers and journals, and in fact there was a great deal of book publication. For example, numerous books by Trotsky were published in English in the mid-1920s and reviewed or mentioned by such figures as the economist Maynard Keynes, the philosopher Bertrand Russell, and even by the Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin. What this research showed was that the rare occasions on which a writer like Eliot referred to the Russian Revolution, or indeed when they referred to the creation of the League of Nations, which anti-socialists equally disliked, they were referring not to a marginal matter, but to questions which dominated the general culture and climate, even if the writers in question didn't talk about it that much. So that when Eliot wrote in the Criterion, the journal which he edited, that the most important event of the war, he said, was the Russian Revolution, this seemingly passing remark, made with little supporting argumentation, reflected a whole climate of argument and opinion in the general culture and a whole field of still unfolding events. This begins to allow us to see that Eliot, in his poetry and in his thinking, may have been more shaped and influenced by the Russian Revolution than we have previously chosen to think. At the very least, the study which I undertook reveals a different cultural climate in the decade or so following the First World War than might be assumed from familiarity only with the literary monuments of the period. The point here being that we cannot simply look to those products of cultural production on which our gaze has happened to fall as a reflection of their society and time. And we may need to shift our gaze constantly, and as we do so, we may need to reprioritize our objects of study. So in relation to our present crisis, it seems opportune to mention a recent remarkable literary study which focused on the impact of the so-called Spanish flu in the aftermath of the First World War in the years 1918 to 1919. It is well known, and it is often repeated, that the outbreak of flu caused many millions more deaths than the war itself. The author of this study, Elizabeth Outka, that's O-U-T-K-A, who studies viral modernisms, had asked herself what representation there had been in the literature and culture of the post-war of the traumatic effects of the flu and all of the deaths which it brought about. And indeed, for most of us, if we were to ask ourselves this question without the benefits of this book, Viral Modernisms, we would hardly know where to turn. We know that trauma can be deeply embedded, that it can be of a long duration, that it can even last across generations. So Outka had asked an important question indeed. She points out that the flu of 1918 to 1919 was, she says, the greatest disease holocaust that Britain has ever witnessed. Some of the most canonical writers were affected by the flu. Eliot feared that his illness with the flu might have caused him permanent brain damage. The poet W.B. Yeats nursed his wife through a very serious infection with the flu. Some writers, such as the novelist D.H. Lawrence and the poet H.D., barely survived the illness. Virginia Woolf, who initially made fun of the pandemic, soon changed her attitude and began to write seriously about illness. Outka argues that once we begin to examine this phenomenon, our sense of the shape of literary modernism begins to change significantly. One important point which this scholar makes is that in many ways, deaths from the flu were meaningless. They could not be grieved. They did not have a political or national shape, as deaths in war or deaths in political conflict might. One consequence of this for literary historiography, she argues, is that we see this period in terms of the military events of the war and tend to discount or repress or erase the effects of the pandemic. So much as in my own study of the Russian Revolution, I had looked for some of the traces which the revolution left on the work of authors who, at first glance, did not seem to engage with it profoundly. Outka argues that we must learn to look for the traces of the pandemic, both in literature which may already be familiar to us and in other sources, but always with an eye for what these references to illness and death denote, and being mindful of the scale of the infection and the size of the death toll which lie behind them. She argues that many of these representations of the pandemic tragedy are indirect, that they exist in gaps, in fragments, in hints, and in short have what she calls a spectral existence, quite different from the very direct existence which the war assumes in much of the period literature. Indeed, the very nature of the viral infestation was to affect the body itself, to affect sensation, and to rip through families in quite a different fashion than the war had done. The war, she argues, was a competition of male strength, but the pandemic was something else again. So this is an impressive study, and it addresses questions of literary form as well as of literary content. Nevertheless, we might be reminded from our examination of Leavis that there can be some dangers in attempting to map our claims as to what is the central narrative of a period onto the emergence of literary form. That is not to stop us engaging in the exercise. But one thing that scholars of modernist literature have to be mindful of is that their object of study exists at the same time that new technologies are reshaping the whole pattern of cultural consumption. So questions of form do not only go to questions of literary form, but to the technologies of the creation, the modality, and the distribution of cultural work. We hardly need to remind ourselves that Walter Benjamin, or as people say in English, Walter Benjamin, has been one of the principal theoretical interpreters of the impact of technology on the reshaping of culture. Benjamin, in a very famous essay, looks at the impact of photography and film. That famous essay, which most of us probably will know, is called The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, or more literally, the work of art in the age of its technological reproducibility. It deals mainly with photography and film. And we also know about this essay that just as Benjamin, with significant reservations, had attempted to draw optimistic conclusions about the nature of the new artistic technologies and their inherently democratic nature, much of what he argued was countered or rebutted by the far more pessimistic Theodor Adorno, who saw the world of technological entertainment as an increasingly closed, totalitarian, and neutering space. I'm certainly not, in this moment, going to make any form of extended presentation of the theories of Benjamin and Adorno. I am mentioning them here in the context of the aim of this webinar, which is to begin to give some sort of account of literature and life in the era of COVID. And I am perhaps, as much as anything else, reminding myself that our analysis must have a technological dimension, as I see that many of the speakers intend to address during the course of the webinar. I will be interested to hear what people have to say on the topic of the technology and the particular importance and configuration which the technology of internet communication is assuming in the present crisis, especially during the period of lockdown. And lockdown, as you will know, in my country is still sadly continuing, only just beginning to lift. One cautionary tale, though, on the question of our approach to technology comes from my experience just a couple of years ago, although it feels like a couple of centuries ago in the pre-COVID era. This was my experience of a multidisciplinary conference on the topic of populism, which was arranged at my own university. There were a number of distinguished outside speakers, mainly from the discipline of philosophy, and already anticipating that the tone of the conference would be pessimistic, I had prepared a paper provocatively called The Class War of the Culturati, that is, of the cultured people. I had anticipated quite correctly, as it turned out, that the speakers would be united in condemning those forms of populism which seemed to be addressed to the working class, and that there would be no questioning of the universal and therefore perhaps populist assumptions of the cultured class, who I referred to in the talk as the culturati. But aside from my own intended provocation in accusing my educated colleagues of a kind of class war on the lower order, there was also something in that conference which I had not quite anticipated. That was the number of speakers who chose to address the question of social media, seeing it universally in a negative way. None of the speakers had done any kind of research into social media. They were not specialists in the field, the opposite. In fact, they were specialists in completely different fields. Nor did it seem in most cases that they had much experience of using social media. If they did not seem to care to admit it, because they mostly wanted to talk about how stupid it made other people. Now, I know that there are other researchers and many people who come at the question differently. But in the context of that event, I was struck by the manner in which so many, even high-grade philosophers with multiple publications, have taken their opinion about social media from newspapers and magazine articles. Like true populists, they only took the opinions that they had already decided to accept. So it may be that as we sit here today, here being in many places at once, we have all learned a little bit more about the value and purpose of social media and other parallel modes of internet communication, where these become not just an adjunct to everyday life, but the substantial embodiment of many life processes in the realm of both work and personal relationships. I have a feeling that at this webinar, we are going to hear more nuanced and positive evaluations of the technology which frames our existences than I heard at that seminar just 2 long years ago. Stepping away then from those technological questions, I'd like to turn to the question of writing, and particularly of literary writing in the age of COVID. One of the things that struck me about the aim of this webinar, and I'm just making sure I can still see you all because I'm reading from my screen. One of the things that struck me about the aim of this webinar was the attempt to get to grips with something which by definition has only just begun to emerge. In particular, in relation to the question of literary production, there is little in literary writing which is not usually of a long gestation. That means it could be some time before we see the emergence of a literature which will properly reflect on this period. There has begun to be a literature of COVID, though. And in a moment, I will pass on to an example which has recently been published by the British poet Gavin Saleri. Before I say anything or his poem, I would like to share with you a more or less trivial example of my own, which I posted on Facebook just a couple of days ago, though I had been preparing it for some time. I hope you are excited about hearing this work, which so far has obtained 6 likes on Facebook. Only one of those is from my wife, and in truth, none of them are from the rest of my family. So you can tell that this is a fairly monumental event. Part of what I'm noting here, though, is that I did indeed publish it on Facebook. That manner of circulating, and people did truly ignore it, by the way, so that manner of circulating something topical and arguably ephemeral, something which will perhaps meet the eyes of only very few people, turns out to be a good one for our times. While many of us who practice literary studies tend to behave and think like social scientists or like encyclopedists, we would do well to remember that, as Ezra Pound often reminded us, that literature is about mood. So there is something about sharing a piece of text, and not just a poem, using these means, which goes very directly to the question of mood and of sharing and articulating mood. The essay in which Ezra Pound talked extensively about mood is one in which he discusses the evolution of his own very famous haiku-like poem, In a Station of the Metro. In his account of that poem, he explains that he had first written a long poem, but concluded that the best way to capture a mood was to use as few words as possible. In our own context today, we might well think about Twitter and about the restrictions of Twitter on the number of characters, and therefore on the number of words. The example which Ezra Pound had in front of him was the Japanese haiku. My own contribution was also a haiku in that it contains 17 syllables. It does not strictly observe the pattern of the traditional haiku, but instead constitutes an intentional departure. As I say, there were 6 likes for this, so be prepared. The title which I chose was the single word momentum, but in fact I prefer the poem without the title. Here it is. I looked into my phone. There was nothing there. I looked into my phone. So, while this is only about the 3rd poem I have ever published, which does seem to confirm some of the dangers about the ease of publication for the merest amateur, which social media has now enabled, I would like now to turn to the much more substantial work by the serious and well-established poet based in London here, Gavin Sellerie. And Sellerie, if you're wondering, is Sellerie. Once again, this poem, this very recent poem, was published on the internet, this time in the pages of a journal called Stride. The advantage of an internet publication is that a journal can become known to those who are interested. It acts as a kind of focus, but unlike a print journal, it can be very responsive. So while a tweet or a Facebook status update are supremely ephemeral and mostly disregarded, the internet journal has some of the advantages of social media in terms of spontaneity and some of the advantages of print media in terms of focus and consolidation. That's an aside. So Gavin's poem is called Biocalypse, by analogy with bio and apocalypse. So it is characterized by what he calls a dense drive of language, which he tells me is intentional, or rather a reflection of circumstances. I mentioned that this is what he told me in an email, not by way of giving a private insight, as one might obtain by consulting the posthumously published letters of, say, T.S. Eliot, but by way of characterizing another aspect of the immediacy of communication and its manner of framing the cultural product, where it turns out that the framing is as much part of the cultural artifact as the supposed object. Gavin also mentioned to me that a second poem will follow soon, and again, this demonstrates a certain kind of flexibility of the internet medium, in that the first part of the poem can be published, there is no need to wait. If the second part arrives, it can be added. If Gavin changes his mind about writing a second part, then something else can happen. Everything is open. I did want to mention that Gavin has characterized this poem in terms of the dense drive of language. That's because I'm not certain how much responsibility I can take for all of the meanings which it harbors. You'll see here in the back of my mind, I've got the question of how long did it take for people to understand how to read The Waste Land? How long did it take for them to understand how to read Ulysses? As a literary scholar writing about historical work, I'm accustomed to having the time to reflect over a period on any work which I wish to discuss. That's not a possible perspective when it comes to contemporary work. I have noticed that the contemporary reviewer of poetry will often characterize his object in general terms, pick out a couple of attractive quotations, and in general, simply steer the reader towards something that might be interesting or away from something that might not be. Unlike the scholar who can only go into print when they are quite secure in what they were saying, the reviewer has a lighter touch. I am not a reviewer of poetry, but on this occasion, I simply wish to present something without taking full responsibility for it. So here are just 2 fairly long excerpts from Gavin's poem, and I don't have a way of sharing the screen with you at the moment, but after I finish the talk, what I may investigate if there is a way for me to, well, after I finish the talk, I can just put the link to the poem, I think, in the chat box for anybody who would like to have a longer look. So here is the first long excerpt. Staring crags in the mirror, would Whiston have lathered and scrubbed his hands to defy the joker who'd climb into your lungs and squeeze your skull? Say Mars has turned his face to earth and marched into a cell unpestered with people, gifting germs on a writer's finger. Would you wipe those invisible dots and sleep in a glass bed under glass sheets? Through queasy time, we picture a bat in a far-off cave that has in its folds some spirit may spike a protein under scales of what makes meat in a sloshed market, taken, passed down global tracks, aired in or sailed out to get over and over as, too late, a masterless face tries to close the grid, a grunting Gurgashite elected at a leaky border, the fist and glove won't steal. And the second excerpt, WhatsApp, what's happened? Who were you next to? Just a pair of lacy knickers jutting from a split bin bag. It's no use blaming a phone mast for the ooze that clings. But whatever it takes is a tall promise to meet as week by week the bills come in. If a tiger gets it, he doesn't take one for the team, no. His hello stutters and trips from hill to hell, messing fire between stripes. Fierce electric quivers, unable to spring. We're all in the zoo or quad, stirring a quarantini with a biro to sit before dinner. Won't farmer these frights away? So that's the end of the second long quotation there. So there are elements here which fulfill the poetic norm of establishing a wide and deep cultural frame of reference. And there are other elements which are entirely contemporary and very immediate in their reference. We can quickly single out, as an example of the former, the reference to Whiston in the first line. In the context of British poetry, Whiston is always likely to be Whiston Hugh Auden, W.H. Auden. And if we had any reason to doubt the expression, to doubt the reference, the expression crags in the mirror gives us the notion of Auden himself, with his famously craggy face in later life, looking in the mirror as he washes his hands. Now, quite why Auden is invoked here is another question. It would be easy, but in a way trivial, to say that Gavin sees himself in Whiston, and I'll leave it at that. One poet comparing himself to an illustrious predecessor. But we can also reflect that Auden left us a number of poems which are a meditated characterization of the blankness of contemporary evils. For some reason, the poem of Auden, which came to my mind as I read Gavin's poem for the first time, was a poem called The Shield of Achilles. When I went back to that poem, I could find no strong reason in verbal terms for making the connection. But in the light of the comments of Elizabeth Outker, the scholar I was discussing a short time ago, in the light of the comments that she makes about the different literary and stylistic questions of the presentation of disease as opposed to the presentation of war, I wonder if I'd accidentally picked up on the right thing. Already, the poem The Shield of Achilles is a poem which asks questions about the representation of war. It imagines Artemis, the mother of Achilles, looking over the shoulder of the armorer Hephaestus at the shield that he is preparing for her son. Her expectations are dashed by the reality. While she expects a celebration of war and its glories, she is presented only with the blankness of war and the banality of its evil, the emptiness of human suffering. I haven't asked Gavin if this is what he was thinking about. I didn't know that his partner suffered, I do know, I should say, that his partner suffered from COVID for several weeks, very badly, but did subsequently recover. But I found myself wondering whether Gavin had been thinking about the question that W.H. Auden has asked himself about the proper representation of war, and whether Gavin has asked himself a similar question about the proper representation of disease, of pandemic. Now, in contrast to this high cultural reference to W.H. Auden, if we wish to call it that, are the references to the contemporary vocabulary with which, at the time Gavin was writing, and already things have changed, I would say, we were being asked to navigate the pandemic. This vocabulary is presented through a questioning and perhaps caustic optic in Gavin's poem. Would Auden scrub his hands, as we are all asked now to do? What would happen, the poem asks, if the god Mars were to abandon his customary martial stance and come sneaking into the very cells of our bodies? How do we locate ourselves in relation to an enemy which does not stand in front of us, but which has a kind of queasy and ghostly origin in the bodies of bats in a Chinese market? And surely, in reference to the politics of Great Britain and of Boris Johnson and his government, the reference to the clumsy militaristic attempt to close the border, which we are given to believe came too late and failed. The stuttering reference to WhatsApp needs little explanation, it seems to me, in the context of this webinar. The reference to the tiger, which has lost its spring, again confirms the notion of the strong and combative body, which cannot, through its customary strength and agility, combat the virus. I haven't commented on every word and phrase in this poem, and in fact, as yet, I couldn't do that. As the poem seems to express a kind of immediate influence, immediate impulse, so too my conveying it to you via this webinar, just maybe 10 days after it was posted, is the product of a similar attempt at timeliness. What I've tried to point to in this poem is a combination of vocabularies. The grand poetic, if I may express it like that, and without implying any judgment as to what is grand or otherwise, and contemporary discursive language, especially as it relates to the vocabulary of the grandly poetic. In case it might be thought that the grand poetic represents the meditated dimension and the contemporary discourse is relatively spontaneous, we should remember that contemporary discourse is highly mediated by teams and layers, layers of people and institutions, governments and media outlets, often with a transnational or global dimension. The poet, for all their reference to the canons and orthodoxies of tradition in all its weight, is still a solitary figure, the very icon of the individual, trying to navigate the incessant languages and language games which surround and penetrate us much like a virus. Poetry, though it seeks very often distance and reflection, Poetry, though it seeks very often distance and reflection, cannot step out of the present. What I've tried to illustrate in reference to Gavin's poem is both the manner in which a poem and its language can constitute an urgent form of reflection and an urgent, though perhaps partial, response to circumstances. It is not only a question of the poem as a thing in itself. In the discussion of the distribution of this poem,
may I request you to conclude?
Via a journal which is housed on a blogspot, and in the manner in which it was framed to me in a personal email, I've tried to say something about the mode of conveying what is still a traditional linear poetic object, even where the technology has taken us several steps away from the limits of print culture. And I'm suggesting that in the case of this work, at least, the writing itself in its immediacy.
Professor David, I'm
Hello.
sorry to interrupt you. The time is running out. May I please request you to conclude?
I am actually a minute away from concluding.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
No, I do understand. I wasn't strongly aware of the time limit. So all I wanted to say was that while the present crisis has not created internet publication from scratch, as if it did not previously exist, at this moment and in relation to a poem which deals with the crisis itself, we can see, perhaps just a shade more clearly, some of the adjustments which even the more traditionally rooted literary production has begun to make. And that was my conclusion. So I apologize for taking a little bit too much time there.
Thank you, Professor David. We understand. Will help us. Thank you, Professor Shri Prakash Mani Tripathi. Uh, I hope I'm audible to everyone. So we are going to have the presidential remark by Honorable Vice Chancellor Professor Shri Prakash Mani Tripathi, Vice Chancellor IGNTU. Just let me brief you all a little about Sir. Professor Shri Prakash Mani Tripathi did his MA and PhD in political science. His area of specialization is international politics and Indian government politics. He has more than 39 years of teaching and research experience. He has been awarded with Shri Nihal Singh Yadav Indian Political Science Association National Award for special contribution to the study of ancient Indian politics in 2014. Ganesh Shankar Vidyarthi Award in 2018. Hindi Sansthan Lucknow and Shiksha Vid Samman in 2020 by Sahityak Sanskritik Shodh Sanstha Mumbai. He has been actively engaged in teaching and administering at various posts in his field for more than 3 decades. He's been Chief Proctor, Treasurer, Dean, and the Head of the Department of Political Science, Deen Dayal Upadhyay, Gorakhpur University. He has supervised 27 PhD and has published 24 books. He has been political analyst and member of editorial and advisory board of National News Network, Journal of Government and Political Studies by Punjab University, Raj Shastra Vitika, a research journal, Gorakhpur, Social Scientist Journal, Kashi Journal of Social Sciences, to name a few. He is also a life member of professional bodies like Indian Politics, Science Association, Indian Society of Gandhian Studies, Indian Institute of Public Administration, New Delhi, UP Political Science Association. Above and apart from all this, he also takes keen interest in bringing quality education and modern facilities for young school-going kids and visits schools in the university campus frequently. I must tell you, one who reads, writes, sees, inquires, lives in the company of learned men, his intellect expands, just like the lotus leaf does because of the rays of the sun. IGNTU feels illuminated to grow under the able guidance of Professor Shri Prakash Mani Tripathi, who has always been a source of strength and support in our lives also. I would like to request Professor Shri Prakash Mani Tripathi, our Honorable Vice Chancellor, the sculptor of human character, to enlighten us with his presidential remark. Here you are, sir. Please connect.
Thank you, Dr. Tausif. On behalf of IGNTU, I welcome all the guests, dignitaries, and persons of eminence, and those persons who are connected this way or that way on this digital platform to make fruitful and successful 2 days international webinar on literature and life in the era of COVID-19, organized by Department of English and Foreign Languages. I am happy enough to be connected with my friend Professor Raj Kumarji, Honorable Vice Chancellor, Punjab University, Chandigarh. Just I was getting the point from Professor David Ayers, University of Kent, UK. Professor Madhumita Das ji, Honorable Vice Chancellor, Fakir Mohan University, Balasore. Professor Stephen Gill from Canada. Besides, Dean Faculty of Humanities, Professor Khem Singh Deheria ji. Head Department of English Literature, Professor Krishna Singh ji. Professor Abhilasa ji. Dr. Muhammad Tausifur Rahman. Professor Ajay Shukla ji, and all the other persons who are on this platform to deliver very important lectures to enrich the field of knowledge. It is well known to us that COVID-19 pandemic has immensely changed cultural, social, economic, and literary scenario of the world, where we are discussing the issues regarding man versus machine, talent and technology, migration, reverse migration, environment, and so many issues where we have to deal with the readiness of universities and institutions for the new revolutionary changes in education system. We have also to deal with perspectives of self-reliant society and the new requirement of literary world. I am hopeful that all of you will discuss all these issues in details. We have to deal with the alternative modes of teaching, changing socio-cultural behavior, dislocation and trauma of migration and homelessness, role of TV and social media in shaping the responsive masses, about nationalistic feeling and awakening the religious spirit. Webinar has also incorporated the emerging new lifestyle, dietary habit, health awareness, and India's approach towards COVID-19 and its global acknowledgement. मुझे बहुत प्रसन्नता है इस विषय पर आयोजित इस वेबिनार से, कारण इस समाज को झंकृत करने की क्षमता साहित्य में होती है, न करने की क्षमता, अपितु जागृत करने की क्षमता, सतर्क करने की क्षमता, सावधान करने की क्षमता और आगे बढ़ने की प्रेरणा देने की क्षमता साहित्य में होती है। और साहित्यकार अपने विविध प्रकार के लेखों से, कविताओं से, रिपोर्ट से, छोटी छोटी कविताओं से, छोटे छोटे गद्य लेख से, छोटी छोटी कहानियों से हमें संबल प्रदान करने का काम करते हैं। आज का दौर एक कठिन दौर है जिसमें समाज का ताना बाना ही बदल गया है। आय, उत्पादन और आजीविका के साधन लगभग अवरुद्ध हैं, आवागमन के साधन लगभग अवरुद्ध हैं। हम सभी अपने स्थान पर, विशेषकर परिवार में केंद्रित हैं। हमारी व्यवस्था में पूरी धरा को ही परिवार माना जाता है। कहा जाता है अयम निजः परोवीति गणना लहुचेत साम उदार चरिता नाम तो वसुधैव कुटुंबकम। हिंदुस्तान उदार चरित्र के लोगों का देश है और हमारे लिए पूरी धरा ही एक परिवार है। इसलिए न केवल हम इस परिवार की चिंता कर रहे हैं जहां हैं, अपितु विश्व परिवार की भी चिंता कर रहे हैं। और इस प्रक्रिया में हमारे यशस्वी प्रधानमंत्री जी के जो वक्तव्य हैं, उनके द्वारा कराई जा रही तैयारियां हैं, वो बेमिसाल हैं। शिक्षा के क्षेत्र में माननीय मानव संसाधन मंत्री जी का निर्देश संदेश हम सभी के लिए बहुत ज्यादा उपयोगी होता है। आज के जो इश्यूज हैं, जैसे एक नया शब्द आजकल हम लोग रिवर्स माइग्रेशन दे रहे हैं, आय, आजीविका और आवागमन के साधनों की कठिनाई के चलते हम मूल स्थान को लौटने लगे हैं। ऐसे में भविष्य क्या होगा, किस प्रकार के साहित्य की रचना होगी? माना कि जो पीड़ा है एगो नहीं है, इस पर बहुत ज्यादा लिखा गया, बहुत ज्यादा विचार भी किया गया और कई माध्यमों से साहित्य की रचना हुई। हमारे साहित्यकार अपने अपने स्थान पर, मीडिया के लोग अपने अपने स्थान पर, जो मीडिया में नहीं है, जो साहित्यकार नहीं है, उन लोगों ने भी भावना प्रधान होकर बहुत कुछ लिखा। टिप्पणियां भी एक प्रकार की साहित्य होती हैं। इस तरह विभिन्न विधाएं साहित्य की आज बहुत ज्यादा व्यवस्थित हो गई हैं और हम कह सकते हैं बहुत ज्यादा हो गई हैं। इस कोरोना फेज में प्रोफेसर कृष्णा सिंह जी से मेरी चर्चा हो रही थी कि इसे कोरोना फेज कहें या कोरोना एज कहें या एरा ऑफ कोरोना कहें, सभी महत्वपूर्ण शब्द हो गए हैं। और इस जो हमारा थीम है इन द एरा ऑफ कोविड-19, इतना अधिक साहित्य लिखा गया इतने अल्प अवधि में कि कभी मुझे याद नहीं है इतिहास के किसी दौर में इतने कम समय में इतने अधिक साहित्य की रचना हुई है। कारण कि आज का साहित्यकार मनोदशा पर विचार कर रहा है। मानव की स्थिति पर विचार कर रहा है, न केवल प्रगति के सोपान क्या होंगे, स्थान क्या होंगे, नियमन क्या होंगे, इस पर चर्चा करने के, तो मनुष्य की वेदना क्या है, हमारी संवेदना क्या है, हमारी सोच की दिशा क्या होनी चाहिए, इस पर आज का साहित्यकार विचार कर रहा है। इसलिए आज का दौर भावना प्रधान साहित्य का दौर है। इसमें हम इमोशनल हो गए हैं अपने प्रति, अपने लोगों के प्रति, अपने से जुड़े हुए लोगों के प्रति। विश्व साहित्य इस दिशा में ज्यादा सक्रिय है कि मनुष्यता का रक्षण कैसे करें, हमारे जो ह्यूमन वैल्यूज हैं उसे हम फिर कैसे इनकैलकेट करें। हमने उदारवाद की व्यवस्था में, भौतिकतावाद की व्यवस्था में ह्यूमन वैल्यूज को कहीं किनारे छोड़ दिया था। लस्ट बहुत ज्यादा महत्वपूर्ण हो गया था कि हाउ टू अर्न मनी एंड हाउ टू एंजॉय। ये दो मिशन हमारे हो गए। अब इस मिशन से हम किनारे हो गए। अब हम बता रहे हैं कि कैसे हम संतोष पूर्वक जीवन जिए, कैसे हम प्रकृति का विधान करें, पर्यावरण का ध्यान रखें। ये सारे विषय अब साहित्य के दायरे में हैं। एनवायरमेंटल इश्यूज डिस्कस हो रहे हैं, सिक्योरिटी इश्यूज डिस्कस हो रहे हैं, न्यूट्रिशन, मेडिटेशन, रिक्रिएशन पर हम नए सिरे से विचार कर रहे हैं और यह आज की आवश्यकता है। साहित्य समाज का दर्पण होता है, एक ऐसा आईना जिसे हम हमेशा साथ लेकर के चलते हैं, हमारे साथ चलता है, जहां जाते हैं दिख जाता है और इसमें गतिविधियां दिखाई देती हैं समाज की, राष्ट्र की, वैश्विक व्यवस्था की और विश्व मानवता की। तो आज साहित्यकार के लिए ज्यादा जरूरी है कि संवेदना का वह स्वर वह उच्चारित करे जिसमें हमारी मनुष्यता जागृत हो जाए, एक दूसरे से सहयोग करने के लिए, व्यवस्था के साथ समन्वय करने के लिए, साथ ही हम भी जिएं, औरों को भी जीने दें, इस भाव को भरने के लिए। यह भी ध्यान रखें कि हमारी इस प्रक्रिया में धरा में सर्वत्र सुख आए। हमारा सिद्धांत है सर्वे भवन्तु सुखिनः, सब जगह लोग सुखी हों। हमारे आसपास क्या है इस पर अब साहित्य को ध्यान देना है। आसपास हमारे कितनी समृद्धि है प्रकृति द्वारा प्रदत्त, जिसमें हमारे परिवार के लोग जो वापस लौटे हैं वह पुनः अपनी आजीविका तय कर सकें और यहीं से आत्मनिर्भर समाज, स्वावलंबी समाज और यह स्वावलंबी समाज आगे बढ़कर आत्मनिर्भर राष्ट्र की रचना में सहयोगी बनेगा। इस तरह से क्रमशः हम यह संत्रास जिसका एक दौर है जो आने देने वालों में समाप्त हो जाना है, इस संत्रास को हम पार करेंगे और पुनः हम एक नई सामाजिक व्यवस्था में एक बेहतर भविष्य की रचना करेंगे जिसमें मनुष्यता के लिए स्थान होगा, जिसमें सुख का वह धर्म होगा कि हमारा सुख दूसरे के लिए घातक ना हो, हमारा धर्म दूसरे के लिए घातक ना हो। हम एक स्पिरिचुअल सोसाइटी की रचना करेंगे, आध्यात्मिक समाज की रचना करेंगे जिसमें सबको एक समान देखने का भाव होगा। हम दूसरों के साथ वैसा ही व्यवहार करेंगे जैसा हम अपने प्रति अपेक्षा करते हैं। आज के दौर में साहित्यकार को इन विषयों पर बहुत ज्यादा विचार विमर्श करना है और ऐसा करके ही हम नेशन, माइग्रेशन, टेक्नोलॉजी के साथ लिटरेचर का तालमेल बैठा सकेंगे और इन सभी दिशाओं को हम प्रेरणा देंगे कि मैन वर्सेस मशीन की लड़ाई में मनुष्य विजेता हो। हम केवल मशीन के आश्रय पर न रहें, हम आर्टिफिशियल इंटेलिजेंस के आश्रय पर न रहें। आप साहित्यकार लोग हैं, आप जानते हैं कि मनुष्यता तैयार करने का विधान साहित्य में होता है, साहित्यकार के पास होता है। मुझे पूरा विश्वास है कि संगोष्ठी के माध्यम से आप लोग आने वाली पीढ़ी को मानव मूल्यों से भरपूर करेंगे और हम सब मिलकर विशेषकर ज्ञान की दुनिया बन रही है, उसमें भारत को स्वच्छ, स्वस्थ, समर्थ, समृद्ध और सर्वाधिक महत्वपूर्ण राष्ट्र बनाने में सफल होंगे। मुझे पूरा विश्वास है इन बिंदुओं पर जो परिचर्चा हो रही है बहुत सार्थक होगी। इस वेबिनार की सफलता के लिए मेरी ढेर सारी शुभकामनाएं आप सभी ने ध्यान
बड़ा रिक्वेस्ट है।
Thank you very much, sir. Indeed, your keen observation is the need for growth and development of us as an individual and collectively as a country and then as a world. Thank you very much. Now we are moving to our next special guest, Professor Madhumita Das. May I request Professor Madhumita Das to kindly collect. Let me all brief you a little about Professor Madhumita Das. Professor Das did her MSc and PhD in geology from Utkal University. Her area of specialization is igneous petrology, industrial minerals, and environmental geology. I request everyone to please mute their mic. There's a lot of echo happening. Yes, thank you. She has 37 years of teaching and research experience at Utkal University. She has carried out research as DARD Fellow under Indo-German Exchange Program. She has presented her research work as convener and university delegate at Japan, China, UK, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal, Portugal, Norway, Australia, South Africa, and at several other places in India. She has written 7 books, 126 international and national papers, 130 seminar proceedings, and 21 popular science articles. She has supervised 1 DSc, 22 PhD, and 21 MPhil candidates. She has also completed 7 major research projects sponsored by UGC, DST, and NCW, Government of India. She has served the university in different administrative capacities, and she is the Vice President, South Asian Association of Women Geoscientists, and also a member of various international associations. Apart from teaching, she has keen interest in gender studies and popularizing science among school and college children. Ladies and gentlemen, may I now have the honor to invite our special guest, Professor Madhumita Das, Honorable Vice Chancellor, Fakir Mohan University, Balasore, to sparkle the gathering.
I can start now?
Yes, madam, please.
Extremely sorry for this is the disadvantage of technology. So again, I would like to say
Yes, ma'am,
namaskar
sure.
to all of you. And am I audible? Okay. So as we know, I must congratulate Professor Krishna Singh and his entire team. And also I must say my heartfelt thanks to the Vice Chancellor, Professor Sri Prakash Pandit Tripathi, for giving me this wonderful opportunity. And also I must congratulate the organizers for choosing this very relevant topic, literature and life in the era of COVID-19. As we all know, literature is the mirror of the society, and literature provides the deepest and insightful record of the events. And I am sure if all the deliberations that are will be given in these 2 days, if they are documented, that will be a very useful resource for the future researchers. As we know, all pandemics are mass murderers. Diseases like plague, smallpox, influenza, and cholera, they have devastated our lives. And if we go through the literature, I may just mention a very few of them which I have come across. Rabindranath Tagore, he has written in his novel Chaturanga that there was one affluent man and who turned his house into a nursing home, and while treating the sick people, he was himself succumbed to the disease. Very, very well explained in that novel. And also, the Rabindranath Tagore has also in his long poem, Puratan Bhritya, that means the old man servant, he has also described how the servant was affected by smallpox while treating his Lord. And also, I remember the pandemic of 1918. The entire Delhi was called as good as a city of the dead people. And the 1918, the flu, it affected around 12 to 17 millions of people in India and also 50 million people across the world. Muhammad Ali has described in his novel that Twilight in Delhi. We all know that. And another also, from that 1918, the Suryakant Tripathi Nirala, he has also described about the Hindi poet. And to which university I belong to, Fakir Mohan University, the great father of Odia literature, Fakir Mohan Senapati, has also, who was the great short story writer, in his short story Rebati, which has been translated into so many languages, he has described the devastations which occurred due to cholera. So when after 5 decades, all this pandemic, COVID-19 will be a part of history, but definitely literature is going to be strengthened in the history. So I think all the participants who are associated with this webinar, they all are literary people, belong to the literature subject. So all the creative writings, all their poems, short stories, whatever they are going to write now will be a part of history after 4 to 5 decades. So coming to the life, I remember once the tech giant Bill Gates, he was talking in a TED show, and in 2015, he was talking that no missile, no weapon, no war is going to devastate the world, but an infectious virus will come and it will affect the world, and it will take more than 10 million people. And just after 5 years, it is happening now. So what I feel, what are the changing scenario in our lives? All of us, we are facing, the entire world is in lockdown, and about starting from school to primary school to secondary school to tertiary level also, 1.5 billion students, they are not going to the school, college or university physically. No travel, there is a collapse of trading, and also the migrants, they suffer from economic crisis, and that economic crisis is leading to the mental health problems. So these are the changes that is happening to us in the present day society. And to add to that, many people, like it was happening in only in the IT sector, now it is very common that work from home has been common to many sectors. So the work from home also has a different angle because there is a increase in domestic violence. I think all this will be reflected in the literary articles, and they will be part of the history in future. But one I would like to mention about the remarkable changes that is happening to the educational institutions. Educational institutions means, I think, starting from school to college to university, we all have shifted to online classes. When we are talking about online classes, now the faculty members who are attending this webinar, I must say that the era of classroom teaching, the traditional teaching era is gone. Now we have to opt for blended learning. Blended learning or the flipped classroom is the normal pedagogy which is enabled with technology. That blended learning, I think, after the COVID-19 also is going to continue. So in the new normal situation after the COVID-19 also, we have to opt for this online learning. And in the online learning also, before the traditional teaching was teacher-centric, now the online learning it is going to be student or the learner-centric. So that also we have to take into consideration, and the entire educational institutes, we have to opt for that online learning, and that will be, sometimes it will be like personalized teaching. What I mean by personalized teaching means, in the class, in the original traditional classes, what was happening, there were three groups of students. The 10% were average students out of a 50. Suppose there are 50 students in a classroom, 10 were brilliant and 30 were average and 10 were very slow learners. So now in the present situation, when we are talking about online classes, we have to take care of these slow learners and we have to focus on the remedial learning also. Now there are many challenges. Many challenges are there. We all are facing challenges. Let me give you one example from geology, and we must see that these challenges are, we can turn them into opportunities. There is one element that is C. C is carbon. When carbon is present just at a shallow depth below the crust of the earth, it turns out to be a very light sedimentary porous rock, which we call it as a coal. The same carbon, when it is present at a greater depth, it turns, and it is subjected to tremendous pressure and temperature, that the carbon changes into diamond. So the choice is ours. If we cannot sustain the temperature or pressure of the earth, we will turn into coal, and if we can sustain this challenge, we will come out as shining, dazzling diamond. So my dear friends, this is the time we have to face the challenges and make these challenges into opportunities. Time has given us, with the COVID-19 has also another aspect to it. It has affected people irrespective of caste, creed, race, the black and the white, they are affected. All and the poor and the rich, all are affected. So I think in the entire world, there is a time we are passing through. There is only one religion, that is humanity. So I am very positive. This crisis will be over, and time will come, and then we will turn this crisis into opportunity. And I would like to conclude by quoting Carlos Santana. One day there will be no borders, no boundaries, no flags, and no countries. And the only passport will be the heart. So I again thank all the organizers for giving me this wonderful opportunity. Let us all make harmony with nature and do our bit to make this world a safer, a peaceful world. Thank you very much, friends. And this COVID-19 will be over. Again, there will be peace and harmony in the world, and we will have a new normal situation, and we will have a peaceful life. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, madam. Indeed, this was very inspiring and motivating for all of us. And by that time, I'll just introduce Professor Rajkumar to all of us. Professor Rajkumar is a distinguished academician, researcher, and educational administrator. He is currently the Vice Chancellor of Punjab University, Chandigarh. He completed his PhD from Banaras Hindu University and DLIT from University of Lucknow. He brings with him a rich mixture of professional integrity and administrative experience. Professor Rajkumar has been actively engaged in teaching, research training, and consultancy in management field for more than 3 decades. He has been director, dean, and the head of Institute of Management Studies, Banaras Hindu University. He has wide exposure in administration and day-to-day functioning of the university. As the coordinator, technical cell to the Vice Chancellor at BHU, he played a key role in streamlining the administration and bringing more transparency into the system. He's been instrumental in starting new courses, organizing various MDPs, FDPs, and training and skill development programs at Institute of Management Studies. He has mentored more than a dozen PhDs, published many books, and 100+ research papers in the journals of national and international repute. He's been on the editorial board for more than a dozen national and international journals. He is chairman of various decision-making bodies of most prestigious institutions such as Postgraduate Institute of Medical Education and Research, State Higher Education Council RUSA, Chandigarh Region Innovation and Knowledge Cluster, to name a few. Ladies and gentlemen, may I have the honor to invite our chief guest, Professor Rajkumar, the dynamic personality, to be the guiding light and address the gathering. Sir, please connect.
Thank you. At the outset, let me express my gratitude to the Honorable Vice Chancellor of the Amarakntak University, Indira Gandhi Tribal University, and at the same time, the entire academic fraternity who are here to participate in this webinar. There are the distinguished speaker and the guest of honor, Professor Madhumita Das, Vice Chancellor, Fakir Mohan University. At the same time, we can also see the Professor David, Professor Stephen, Professor Krishna Singh, and many more academicians who are from the domain. Actually, let me tell you, basically, I am the man of student of the management. So at the outset, let me say the excuse if there is anything not to be very appropriate to your domain, because you know the literature is a very sensitive matter, and quite often we used to tell and we used to write that it shows the status of the society in which the literature is being written, or in which the literature is being demonstrated or displayed. When you are associating or relating it with the this COVID-19, then it has opened a number of verticals for the deliberation and for the interface that I perceived, especially because at the quite often it is told that whatever is written, that would be out of the experience of the society, and thereafter the authors or the writers starts the writing. So now when we take that background in our thinking, in our mindset, then certainly every writer, or I can say even the common man who are working in this society, would have entirely different type of mindset that has created by this COVID-19. When you look at the education, entire scenario has been changed. The mode of delivery, the content, the understanding, the grasping power of the student, as well as the means teachers. That is one example. Another, if you are looking at the domain of the literature, then certainly I am sure the mindset of the authors and the writer would have been really changed, because they have to think on the many new normalcies type of issues. How the society is struggling. Say, how, if you are talking about the society, then again you have to think over. Let us take one strata about society, the young people. If they are involved in the job, their mindset would certainly combating with a different type of issues. If the students are there, their mindset again combating with a different type of issues. The reason being, the thinking process of the entire society have to look over that, And one many important aspect upon which I want to put your attention, it is the sensitivity of the mindset. Now the people has become so sensitive, whether in terms of the behavior, whether in terms of food habit, whether in terms of their delivery process, whether in terms of the profession in which they are working, because the entire thing changed for an executive. Now the delivery process is entirely different. Working style is entirely different. I can quote one example. Some corporate had allowed the employees to work from their place. Then when you are working at the workplace and when you are working at your home, I am sure the same person, the same human being will act in a different mood. I don't know, when you are working from your home, your mindset certainly would be occupied a number of things which are going on in your home, starting from the kitchen to the drawing room to the lobby, as well as from the at your gate, outside the gate even. Whereas you had worked in a quite different type of in corporate office, you are fully air conditioned, you are seeing your boss always, you are seeing your fellow colleague, you are seeing your customer, your mindset is entirely different. So that may be one aspect of literature. In the same way, the mindset of the student and the teachers, we have to look at in a different way. Why I am telling it? The environment, the working environment have affected the human being very, very negatively or the positively. That would depend upon your mindset. And the last thing that I want to tell you, now the delivery process of the literature will also be affected only by writing, only by say displaying, only by saying is one aspect. But at the same time, you have to, as a writer, you have to think how we can communicate is very strongly to the human to the human being, because the process of grasping of the human mind, the mindset is also blocked. A number of things have captured the place. So in that way, you have to think over that. And the last point that I want to put before you, as a management student, you are away from the I'm not telling the maximum degree of professionalization. Now you have to come together in the sense to make the literature more professional, more people reachable, more job oriented. Because now when you are talking about the youth or everybody is at the stake of job, searching for the job, losing the job. So it is the time when you have to project the people how they can involve themselves with the job, self-employment, or you can say startup type of activities. So these are the also areas where you have to start writing, because whatever the mirror you will see, so did the society will follow that. So now the first and foremost think of writers now from my mind, they have to revisit the entire thing, starting from the thinking to the writing and to the delivery to the society and the mechanism that you are going to do. If you are depending upon the traditional or the things which are going on before the COVID, I think there would be a lot of blockage in the system. So from the starting of the thinking, your mindset, when you are searching any issues upon which you want to start your pen, from that to the delivery of your cooked material in form of the literature to the society, the entire thing you will find the change, and that change will be the long lasting, as the scientists and the researchers and medical professionals are telling that this corona is not a virus of one variety. The corona family, this COVID family, is a very large. In near future, it would come, I don't know, but maybe more fatal than this one. This virus can be, although there is no medicine, by distancing, by that means precautions, we can get rid of that. But when any virus of this family may be inflated with the air, you just imagine what will be the scenario. It is the present scenario. By the contact, you are avoiding the contact, keeping the distances, you are free to the maximum extent. Suppose if it is the aerial borne or aerial means spreading, then the scenario will be changed. We can't tell the next generation of the COVID will not be aerial borne or aerial communicable like that. So with this, I am very happy, and particularly once again, I would like to express my gratitude and thankfulness to the entire literature family. And you made this so very live. I was, although I was busy with the other work, but at the same time, I was just told my office to get connected whenever I can get the entry and interact with the very esteemed writers and the academicians. And I have very very long relation with this tribal university. I have been in the finance committee, one of the very important committee. I have seen the first brick that has been laid down in the campus. Starting from that, I have seen a very beautiful campus. I certainly would get the courage to say that you must visit that campus. Really wonderful, really very nature loving, and at least stay and spend a week over there. You will get entirely different type of vibration and the feeling, and particularly it is very essential to the writers like you, the literary person like you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, sir, for sparing your valuable time. Indeed, your valuable insights will help us all to improve and develop as a better human being. Thank you very much, sir. Now, moving on to our address by guest of honor, Professor Stephen Gill. We have got, luckily, his recorded video clipping, which we are going to share very soon. Professor Stephen Gill was born in Sialkot, which is now in Pakistan. He studied in India, Agra and Punjab University, and in Canada, Ottawa University, and England, Oxford University. He is a multiple award-winning Indo-Canadian poet, fiction writer, literary critic, and essayist. He has authored more than 30 books, including novels, literary criticism, and collection of poems. In addition to these books, he has written and published book reviews and research papers on writers and peace. His writings have appeared in around 1,000 publications. Some of his Urdu, Hindi poems have been performed by prominent singers of India and Pakistan in 3 volumes. He is the subject of doctoral dissertations and research papers. 13 books of critical studies have been released by book publishers on his works, and more are on the way. The focus of his writing is love and peace, based on his ideology of live and let live. May I have the honor now to connect our guest of honor to invigorate us with his kind, loving, and peaceful words at this time of COVID 19. Please connect.
Friends, I'm thankful to the Department of English and Foreign Languages of Indira Gandhi National Tribal University in India for inviting me at the International Online Conference on Literature and Life in the era of COVID-19. I am delighted to be here as the guest of honor to express my feelings, to express my experiences about the impact of COVID-19 on the literature of today. I'm happy to share that on 25th of June, only 2 days ago, was my birthday, 86th birthday. Before going further, I would like to thank the chairman, the Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Prakash Mani Tripathi. The Honorable Vice Chancellor definitely is the guardian angel of this gathering of concerned intellectuals. Before touching the coronavirus, a dangerous creature, an obnoxious germ, I would like to thank also the convener of the conference, Professor Krishna Singh. I met him before at Indrakala Sangeet University in Chhattisgarh and also at Indra Gandhi Tribal University. Let me be frank that it is, my friend, a real challenge to organize such a conference about an invisible virus that has changed the world order within months. Scientists are still working to know the nature of this virus, and world governments are extremely puzzled, and common persons are angry and frustrated, while some powers are using this situation to grab the land of their neighbors. That is a step that does not lead to peace. Rather, this step leads to grab self-destruction that leads to self-annihilation. I find no difference in the lust of this virus and the lust of the scientists to manufacture this obnoxious creature. My imagination goes a few years back when I was invited by Professor Krishna Singh to come to the campus of Indira Gandhi National Tribal University. It was towards the end of February in 2013. As a poet, I was delighted to be amidst these surroundings that help to get over creative buns. The literature of every kind, whether it is tribal literature or non-tribal literature, it is going to take another shape because of the invisible tiny virus that has impacted every corner of life, in every corner of the world, especially its impact on economic order. Literature cannot exist for a long time without life, as the tiny coronavirus cannot exist for more than 74 hours, as it said, outside the human body. Take any literature, and we find that it reflects its age. So the literature of today will reflect COVID-19. This phenomena will impact every media, will impact every platform, particularly the digital technology. One proof is right here. This proof is reflected in this digital conference. When I participated in the conference at this university in 2013, this type of conference was not imaginable. But today, it is a reality. A poet cannot live in an ivory tower forever. If today Shakespeare is alive, it is also because Shakespeare has produced in his plays social, political, economic, moral, and scientific ideas of his times. Shakespeare has proved that a literature which does not reflect the spirit of the time, that literature cannot be great and cannot be of lasting nature. Even in Paradise Lost, which is timeless, John Milton expresses the moral controversies of the Protestants, of the Roman Catholics that plagued the time and sent a British king to the gallows. At this time, I think of T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot has said somewhere that the soul of a nation, true ideals of its civilization, real message of the people's inner self, is expressed in its literature. Today, the world is torn asunder with fear. Today, the world is torn asunder with hatred, and the root cause is lust. The root cause is greed. The root cause is to grab more. There is still a grave danger of another world war which may annihilate poets, annihilate our civilization. Under such circumstances, serious and committed poets and novelists and other writers cannot turn their backs to this reality like the Lady of Shalott. Within few months of its appearance, COVID-19 has started impacting poets and other creative writers and artists. Poets are using their lockdowns to express their anger and to express their frustrations, as well as solutions. This trend is more visible, is more obvious in poetry and also in letters to the editor. The impact of COVID-19 on the vocabulary is obvious. According to one estimate, around 1,000 new words of neologism and definitions have been added to English language by COVID-19. In other words, old definitions of several terms of expressions have been updated, and most of these expressions are not new. Only their definitions have been widened, and some of these expressions include, you must have heard, asymptomatic, frontline health worker, abbreviations like PPE, that stands for personal protective equipment, hanker down, social distancing, physical contact, self-isolation, quarantine and self-quarantine, keep distance, mask or N95 mask, ventilator, non-essential, lockdown, positive, negative, RONA, that stands for coronavirus, flattening the curve, hand hygiene, respirator, and so on and so forth. COVID-19 has and will continue finding platforms for poets and storytellers to express themselves. I have explained sometimes back in my feature IT3 that appeared on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook, and is listed in detail on my website stephengill.ca, and it is listed under my conversations. I will quote a few lines here to share that it is human desire to tell and hear stories. This desire to tell and hear stories is so strong, so intense, that stories were carved on stones long before the recorded history began. When it was not possible to record, people memorize raw feelings and events. One example is Aesop's fables. People were proud to present those animal tales orally to teach morals. People were proud to present those animal tales orally to teach morals. It is a long journey from the paintings in the caves to the modern movies and novel writing. The form has been changing according to the time, but not the basic desire to share. That basic desire to share is the same. That cannot be deleted or eliminated. The long journey of the desire to share confirms that people love to tell and hear experiences. People love to hear and tell stories. This inherent desire to tell and hear stories will not die, and so novels and movies will not die. Although their ways of presentation will keep on changing. I believe that digital technology will play a strong part in shaping new forms of expression. As far as subject is concerned, COVID-19 will do the work. Poets will have new themes, as several of them have already started using new themes and new subjects. Story writers will also use COVID-19 for their themes. I have also used it in my essays and also used on YouTube. Two of my short stories will be critically examined by university teachers. One story is titled Mask. Another story is titled Self-Isolation. The story in Mask is about a Canadian who goes in search of a face covering, this mask, to know how a mask looks like. He wants to use it properly in case of any emergency. But to his disappointment, he finds all the masks have disappeared from pharmacies. He finds all the masks have been bought. He finds that some immigrants bought them all. The purpose is not given, but it can be imagined. In another story, Self-Isolation, the main character, who happens to be a poet, tells his friend that national lockdowns do not bother him because as a poet, self-isolation has been his life. There are reasons given in the story about the benefits of self-isolation, benefits to artists. The literature of today has started reflecting the impact of COVID-19, what is in human thoughts, what is in human actions, are reflected in the literature. I plan to write much more on this theme, on this subject, if I get time and encouragement. Imagination is there. Because it is a new subject, it is still fluid and is still being shaped in our thoughts and ideas and actions. The process will be fast if I keep receiving encouragement. I am happy that Indira Gandhi Tribal University has taken steps to encourage me and others by asking some teachers to critically examine my two stories connected with COVID-19, and also by giving me an opportunity to express my feelings, to express my experiences about this virus that has been created by maniac messiahs. I would like to share that I have written a critical study on A.G. Wells. This critical study came out in 1975, and it is titled Scientific Romances of A.G. Wells. During my research, I was strongly impacted with one story of Wells called The Invisible Man. This is a story of a man's lust and his inevitable downfall. Griffin, a scientist, finds the secret to be invisible to obtain power and to obtain wealth. He established a reign of terror through the misuse of his scientific knowledge. This scientist named Griffin uses all his resources. He uses all his time, including his creativity, including his money and his intellect, to discover how to be invisible to satisfy his lust for power. He steals even his father's money. Griffin has no regret over the theft. This man feels no sorry or pity for his father who commits suicide. This story is a warning to scientists to be cautious of their inventions, to be cautious of their discoveries, as misuse of science invites catastrophes. In his invisible form, Griffin is continually jostles unwittingly by passers-by, and he is sniffed by dogs. He cannot eat in public as his food remains visible, but is perceived as a great power through weakness that leads to his misery. He gets in a worse situation than a caged animal is. He starts living in seclusion without friends. He must be fully unclothed to avoid detection, regardless of the temperature while he's going out. His further misery and moral deterioration are noticeable when he vandalizes and attacks people. He plans a reign of terror. He tells his secret to a friend and is eventually killed. It seems to me that the virus of COVID-19 was manufactured in a laboratory. It was manufactured by scientists. I'm sure that such miseries and catastrophes as of Griffin will find translated in the writings of poets, in the narratives of fiction writers, and in the works of other artists. The question arises, who is a Griffin? A tree is known by its fruit. This obnoxious creature, this evil scientist find a secret to satisfy their lust for power. This person will use the virus of COVID-19 for the purpose for which virus is created. Friends, as Griffin was destroyed by his creation, this person will also be destroyed by the same virus. All these things will find their expression in the works of poets, will find expression in the narratives of novelists and other form of artists. Friends, I have taken a little more time, I believe it seemed, than the time that was allotted to me. Thanks for listening so patiently. God bless you all.
Inspiring. Thank you. The two honest words bring equal humility on either side. I personally thank the organizing team and the head of the Department, English and Foreign Languages, Professor Krishna Singh, for giving me the chance to learn and enjoy being the I request Professor Abhilasha, co-convener, Department of English and Foreign Languages, to kindly present vote of thanks. Madam, please connect.
Thank you, Dr. Tausif Rahman. Now we are proceeding towards almost the conclusion of the program. So I would like to congratulate every participant around, as your days of hard work were evident in your action, and we have been fortunate enough to have some of the eminent personalities from the academia, utility working for the development of literary arts. Your thoughts have enlightened our minds and have shown us a new path. These events require planning and bird's eye for details. I take this opportunity to thank the chairman of this program, our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Prakash Mani Tripathi, who has always been a support for us, boosting our morale for every program. He is a father figure for this university. He talked about the self-reliant society, what now in our own country we know as Atmanirbhar Bharat. Sir, you also said that now this is the time to return back to our root. Thank you, sir, for your noble thought and guidance. I thank our special guest, Professor Madhumita Das, Vice Chancellor, FM University, Balasore. Ma'am, very recently I was in your university and have been there. It's such a wonderful university to be in. Ma'am, you talked about the impact of lockdown on education, the mental health, which we have seen, some so bad repercussions. We have lost so many lives, and the domestic violence, the rate of domestic violence has raised, and also the issue of blended learning. Whether after the end of Corona, COVID-19 that is, we are going to have the traditional thing is still doubtful. And rightly so, you told that it will be always the blended way of learning, classroom teaching as well as e-learning. Now I thank our guest of honor, Stephen Gill, the noted poet, novelist, critic, and I'm surprised. Once, sir, I was fortunate enough to be in touch with you, and you have a very sharp memory of the time all of us, our department, and you, we enjoyed the time, literary discussions, and so many things. You rightly told, sir, that the human instinct to share, through literature, whatever be the genre, the poem, the short story, the novel, is never going to die. And if literature cannot reflect the mood of the time, the spirit of the time, it is not going to be everlasting. Thank you, sir. Now, I will thank our chief guest, Professor Rajkumar, Vice Chancellor, Punjab University, a man of management and very well a dynamic personality. He told us that rather he provoked us that overall sensitivity of every individual is required, which we are having it anyhow. But the impact of work from home or work from office, how it has impacted the outcome of our work. And I think all of us will agree with it. There is a difference. Now, I'll move to thank our keynote address speaker, Professor David Ayers. He talked about the global impact of Russian Revolution, the Westland, one of the most, eternal poem, I think, the disintegration of the society, and once again, how the society is going to be connected. Literature, like Stephen Gill, he said that if it doesn't share the mood of the time, and if it is not sharing and articulating, then it cannot be everlasting. Now, I would like to thank the reviewers and technical committee members for providing their valuable comments in time and help towards the improvement of quality of papers presented in this webinar. I acknowledge the unwavering support received from the technical team for technical support, plenary speakers and delegates. Our team consisting of Dr. Lalit Mishra, Dr. Devendra Singh, Dr. Prashant Singh, and Arvind Gautam. We are fortunate enough to be backed by a dedicated team. Thank you, staff members, for the involvement and willingness to take on the completion of tasks beyond their respective comfort zones. As human beings have a very short memory, I would like to bring to notice what we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic on a global level. First, change in the entertainment industry to news of a pregnant elephant dying. Locust attacks to Black Lives Matter. Gender parity to racial discrimination to change in global geopolitics. Revenue generation from liquor sales to celebrities suiciding. Global acknowledgement of the Namaskar gesture to Atmanirbhar Bharat to International Yoga Day. Yet we are here discussing because as human beings, we have something called faith, profound faith in humanity. Social distancing made us realize the true physicality of human society. But yet, we have the potential to change this world as our minds can meet on such platforms, irrespective of the distance that separates us physically. I would also like to thank Dr. J.C. Bose, a lesser-known personality, for his contribution in the field of microwave energy, which led to the foundation of inventions like radios and Wi-Fi. Although he never patented his inventions, as he was a true scientist and was okay with being underground as long as the foundations are kept strong. Once again, I would like to thank all of you and pray for the good health and blessedness for all the participants, and would like to take my bid with this global gesture. Namaskar.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Now, I request all the participants here to just inform you all that our sessions are as scheduled and the plenary session will begin at 2 o'clock. So stay connected and join in at 2 o'clock to all of us. Thank you.